There are 1,000 stories in the Envisioners' future. This is just one of them.
Hey, welcome. It is I, Mr. Dave of the Coplin. How the devil are you? Why God, we are live streaming something who knew we would do. That theme tune, by the way, hilariously was made over 10 years ago for a project that we were doing when the Envisioners was born. The Envisioners was born 11 years ago. So thank you for joining. Thank you for giving me your Wednesday evening. Let me tell you a bit about what we're going to do and why this is so important to me. So if you've been following my story, you'll know for the last 3 decades, I have been trying to engage with everybody talking about the future of work. It would help if I had the books the right way round. You remember The Rise of the Humans, you remember Business Reimagined, trying to reframe our relationship with technology, about how we think about technology and about how it should be a force for good in our lives rather than something that brings us down and holds us back. The reason for this guy, this is 8-year-old me, and 8-year-old me used to, at 6 o'clock on a Wednesday night on BBC2, watch Star Trek. Who knew? And Star Trek was super important because at that time it was the only thing that was out there that really inspired people about the potential of technology to build a utopian future, not a dystopian future. Star Trek was the white mirror before anybody started to really deal with black mirrors, at least on TV anyway. And this was really important to me as a kid, and it's also really important to my generation of computer engineers, because we were inspired to want to go out and do great things. We wanted to help people unlock the potential of technology, to really help use it to transform not just the way they work, but the way that they live their lives. And that's what we were here to do. And that's really what I want to do in this going forward. This is a weekly, hopefully 30-minute window into that world. And I want to bring you dear, lovely viewers, into the conversation too. So over the coming weeks, we're going to be doing a few things. Each show is going to follow a similar format. One of the things I want to bring you is some hands-on stuff. So I don't want to just be sitting here monologuing about what we're going to do and about how cool technology is. I really want to start to show you. And people have asked me about who's the audience for this. And for me, the audience is anybody who really wants to think about the kind of skills that they or their kids are going to need to be successful in the future. And I think really both in terms of the short-term future and the long-term future. So when we emerge from this sort of post-pandemic world, what are we going to be able to do? And also in the longer term, in a world of AI and data, what are we going to do? So these workshops, they're not for techies. They are technical, but they're not, you don't need to be a coder. We'll get into them a bit more. It would help over time if you have a few bits of kit, I'll sort of try and signpost them as we go. Today's demo is really easy and free and cheap, but over time we'll be doing some stuff. I've got to love a Raspberry Pi, so we'll be doing some stuff with the Raspberry Pi. Here's a little half-finished project that John and I have been working on, so a little Pi Zero and a Nature Cam, and of course we'll be revisiting our old friend the Microbit. So again, I'll signpost to these. If you've got these hanging around in your house, that might be cool. We'll also be doing some other stuff with domestic robots, which is what's not to like. So alongside that, every week I want to bring you a review of the news, and this is, I guess, my perspective of the news that's important to the rise of the humans. And so we'll be looking at not just tech stories, but about society stories, about things that really help us engage with technology in a different way. There's going to be some stuff for parents and teachers too, and for kids. It's going to be, again, how do we build out that relationship with technology and really make it worthwhile? And then every week I want to bring in a conversation about the new normal. And I don't want to jump on any bandwagon, and this certainly isn't a COVID-19 podcast, for God's sake. And if anybody tells me that how to cope in a post-COVID world, I'm going to bloody kill them. This is really about what are we going to do in this world. So I'm going to tell you as well. And what I want to do in order to have that conversation is I don't want to just hear from me. I want to bring in friends, people that we've met along the way who've got different and interesting perspectives. So every week we're hopefully going to have a guest speaker. This week it's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to an old friend, actually. This is a guy I used to work with at Microsoft, and we spent many of our days trying to think about how we were going to revolutionize the world. So ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to introduce you to Gary. And Gary is sat in the green room right now. So give us a wave, Gary. Hope the complimentary snacks are going down well. Complimentary in the fact that you've had to buy them, not me, so that's always good. So we'll figure out how that works. So if we come back to the presentation, let us start with this hands-on workshop. And the reason for wanting to do this goes back a few years. And I feel like the story's worth telling just to bring it to life. This is actually a picture from the first workshop that I ever helped to run. I'm going to say I participated rather than running, because the guy who ran it was a guy called Lee Stott in the background. He's standing up on just behind my head here. And I was always the guy, right, that would refuse to do technology demos. I mean, until recently, there was no way I was doing a technology demo in any of my presentations. Why? Because A, I'm not deeply technical, don't tell anybody. And B, they're bloody hard work and they rarely ever work. And you know what, let's not do it. But it was Lee who talked to me about actually you can really engage with kids in particular, but also their parents, if you can bring the technology to life. So we got an opportunity to create a workshop for Butlins, who brilliantly 3 years ago had curated this experience called the Astonishing Family Science Weekend. And me, John and Maggie, we went down to it as guests, you know, as just to go and see what it was like for the first one. And I loved it so much that I went back to them and said, hey, listen, how would you like if Microsoft came along? So Lee had got this workshop. We went there. We had the most amazing time. Over 3 weekends, we trained 1,400 kids and their families to code. And it was the and their families bit where I got the light bulb moment, because what I realized is, you know, engaging kids is pretty simple. You know, you just got to have some fun technology and make it interesting. It's their parents that are the buggers. That's the hard bit, right? But we saw this experience time and time again where the parents, and Butlins had this lovely rule where, you know, you couldn't just drop your kids off. It wasn't like childcare. You couldn't go drop your kids off and then go and sit in the pub or go for a coffee. You had to stay with your kids. And I played the stereotypes, but you would get the sort of classic every session. You would get sort of mum or dad would drop off the little kid, and then the kid would be sitting there in front of a screen and one of these lovely microbits. And the parents would be there like this. Don't know nothing about technology. No, it's just for the kids. It's not for me. And while they're doing that, they're, you know, playing on Candy Crush or on Facebook. But like 10 minutes in, when the kid in question has just created their first animation or delivered their first bit of code, and you see their face light up, that's when you see the parents' reaction. Because the parents' reaction would be like, oh my God, that's brilliant. Oh, how'd you do that? And they're pushing the kid out of the way and they're trying to engage with them. And so I thought that that's something special. And that's why I then took that to places like the Cheltenham Science Festival. Because what I realize in all of this is kids are easy. They love this stuff. It's the parents. It's you guys really who are difficult, because you use this stuff every day. And actually quite a lot of the time it gets in your way, or it doesn't give you the experience that we need to. And so I figured out that we needed a way to engage. And actually the workshops that we did with the kids is the stuff that I now take and I do it even in my corporate stuff, because if I can show an audience of 300 or 400 board execs about how they can create their own algorithm, they start to get excited about it. They start to think about the potential of it. And that's where the magic comes in. So back to today's workshop. All I'm going to do today is I'm just going to set up the workshop. The workshop has already been recorded and it's a separate video that you can stream in your own time. But it's a workshop about algorithmic bias. And one of the things I'm trying to do is, it's really easy for us to be negative about technology, and it's really easy for us to point at all of the problems that technology will bring our society. What becomes harder is to sit there and think about, well, okay, that's interesting. What could I do to make a difference? What could I do to make those problems better? And algorithmic bias is one of the biggest problems I think that we face going forward as a society. And so what I want to do is to bring a little bit of insight into it. Now, before we can get into the bias, I have to remind you a little bit about how algorithms work. So remember that algorithms, they use data to spot patterns that we can then use to power decisions. And the example of how algorithms work is this slide that's behind me. And it's based on some lovely research from Cambridge University in the late 90s that shows it doesn't matter if you speak English, as long as I keep the first and last characters of the word in the right place. I can mix up all of the other characters. I can even misspell words and you'll still be able to read the text. And by the way, this will work in any language. Whatever your native language is, it will work in that language. And it's based on a principle of how you learn to read. So when you learn to read, you're essentially curating a pattern. You're saying that this combination of these letters means this word. And you can see this in action. When you look at something as ambiguous as this slide, your brain actually is calling on that pattern to reassemble the words. So you can see it's this relationship between data, how you're trained, and then the algorithm that powers it, that uses that data to drive a result. So if you understand that, you realize that whilst we talk about AI all the time, and AI is the focus of our attention, all we're really doing is we're talking about the engine at that moment. We're talking about how the engine performs. We're talking about the output of the engine. We don't actually for a minute sit and think about the fuel that we're putting in. And the concept that I want you to think about as we talk about algorithmic bias is how data is the fuel for algorithms. And the better the fuel, the better the algorithm. And this is the principle that we use. And the thing about the data that we use, this is the tricky bit for us to understand, is that the data is always generated by a human. Even if it's actually been generated by a machine, the way it's been coded, the fields that it's been recorded with, were also generated by a human. And the problem with us humans is we are riddled with bias. We have all these cognitive biases. Lovely piece of research. If you look at the website behind me, there's a beautiful infographic of 188 separate cognitive biases that are the things that frame and shape everything that we see and do as human beings. These are the things that color our judgment. These are the things that are the filters through which we interpret the world around us. And these cognitive biases, they're in the data that we generate. They're in the data that we use. They're in the questions that we ask of the data. And actually those biases, they find their way into the algorithms. So let me give you an example of one of those 188 biases. This is an example of something called geographical bias. So if I were to ask you a question, what colour are fire engines? I would be pretty sure that most of you would say fire engines are red. Well, yeah, okay, maybe, but not if you live in Hawaii, because in Hawaii and Southwest Australia, I think, fire engines are yellow. Now, why is this important? Well, this is important. If I'm a coder and I'm writing an algorithm that is intended to spot fire engines on a busy street, you kind of need to know which geography the algorithm is going to be used in, because if I take an English fire engine spotting algorithm and I deploy it in Hawaii, the thing's going to fail. And so this understanding about those biases, and that's one example, so that's geographic bias, but of course there are biases around gender, there are biases around race, all sorts of things. And what becomes super, super important to us is in a world where the algorithms are increasingly being used to make decisions about us, we really need to understand those biases. One of the highlights of my Microsoft career was being called to the Science and Technology Committee, who were writing a green paper on the role of AI and robots in modern society. And they'd assembled this panel of expert witnesses and me, obviously, and they're asking this question. And it's lovely that, you've got this, effectively the MP for Droitwich West is asking the esteemed professor in machine learning, could you explain about algorithmic bias? And my colleague, the professor, launches into this wonderful 30-minute monologue on Bayesian statistical theory, which you can imagine was insightful, but actually inaccessible. And then it was my turn. And the way that I could describe it, and this is the other side of bias is about understanding who the people are that have made the algorithm that you're about to use. And I use the example of me because I spend a lot of time in the UK, and I used to spend a lot of time in my adopted homeland in Canada. And the thing about North America and the UK is you realise that they've actually got two different algorithms for how they make a cup of tea. Now, some of you I know are tea nerds out there, and you'll know that the perfect way to make a cup of tea is with a warmed pot, and you scald the leaves with boiling water, you leave it to steep for a few minutes, you pour it into a mug with a splash of milk at the bottom. That's a nice cup of tea. The North Americans, I found to my displeasure, have a completely different algorithm, except for a few of you, where actually, if you want a cup of tea in North America, what you get is a cup of lukewarm water with a tea bag and the milk and the water at the same time. There you go. Not on my bloody watch. So the point of this story, as I'm trying to sort of address it to the Science and Technology Committee, is you kind of need to know who's made the algorithm before you choose to consume the result of it, because knowing who's made it will affect your judgment. So, for example, when I go out for a cup of tea, I'm going to say, well, whose algorithm you're using? And if you're not going to use my algorithm, do you know what? I'm going to have coffee instead. Really silly, trivial example, but it gives you a really good understanding of these two lenses of bias. One is understanding and being able to interpret the results. Second is anticipating what the results might be based on the people that code the algorithm. Now, this goes into much bigger problems. And there's some fantastic doctoral research being done by a lady called Joy Buolamwini. And the fact that I've even massacred her surname is a great example of geographical bias. This is a video, and I'll put the link into this below, and you can see it after the show, who did a doctorate thesis on the problem with bias in algorithms. Because what she found at the time as she was working is that in terms of facial recognition algorithms, there was a terrible recognition rate for different races, for genders as well. It wouldn't, in this example, you can see Joy behind me not being recognized until she puts on a white face mask. And this was a few years ago. She did some fantastic work. She now works with organizations like Microsoft and Google, amongst others, to raise this issue. Because again, remember how algorithms are created. They're created through data. So if we can make the data better, we can actually make the outcome better. We can actually address that issue for bias. And that really is the best antidote that we can find for algorithmic bias. And it is simply diversity. You will have seen, and if I can dig it out, I'll find the link for it, that fantastic video that BBC Scotland did about the two Scottish guys in a voice activated lift. And if you are Scottish and you've ever tried to have a conversation with Alexa or Siri or Cortana or any of them, you'll know that it doesn't deal well with accents. Why is that? Because there isn't a Scottish person on the team who said, you know what, maybe it should speak to me as well. And whether it's Scottish or Irish or Australian or Italian, it doesn't matter. And the whole point is, if we want our algorithms to be representative of our society, we need the people who make those algorithms to be representative of our society. So that's the setup for the little workshop that I've created. The workshop is really, really simple. And again, I'm recommending, if you've got the time and you're so inclined, do it with your kids, because it's a great conversation, or a great way of having a conversation with them about bias. All you need is a computer, an internet connected computer, even a tablet will do. You need a webcam as well, actually. Sorry, that should have been on the sheet. There's some resources that I'll put in the link, some test files that you can put in, and you need about an hour. Best thing is, it's absolutely free, so it's going to cost you nothing but your time. And this is just a little preview of the video. This is me actually demonstrating. It uses a fantastic resource from Google called the Teachable Machine. Really, really lovely, engaging way of showing people how algorithms work. This is actually based on some material, some education material that's been developed by MIT as well. So huge respect to those guys for putting that out. But anyway, look, give it a go. Be really interested in your feedback. I'd especially love to see how you get on. I also created a little Kahoot quiz if you're feeling competitive at the end of it to see how you got on. And also if there are other topics that you'd be interested in as a workshop, then I'd be really, really open to hearing from you. So that's the workshop side of things. Let's jump straight into the news. And at this point, I'm going to tee up the news article, and then I'm going to bring Gary into the conversation, who's been waiting there ever so patiently, wondering why I haven't bought him any chocolate hobnobs. So let us go to our news. So what I want to do is I just want to pick a few articles a week that I think are really important. The nice thing about, this first episode is I've got a bit of a backlog. The first is there's a lovely organization called Common Sense Media based in the States, but they create a whole load of collateral, which is not about e-safety or keeping your kids safe. It kind of is at its heart, but it's more about how do we enable our kids to be able to engage with 21st century media in a way that adds value to their lives. And every now and again, they put out some really, really great content. And they did something a couple of weeks ago that I think might be helpful to some of you, which is the Parent's Guide to Zoom. And, Zoom has become the de facto standard for pretty much all of us in terms of how we engage with others during this sort of whole lockdown process. But it's not without its challenges. It's a great platform, but it's a relatively new platform. So again, if you get a chance, have a look at this. It's worth checking out. And I'm just going to bring Gary in. Hi, Gary. You doing okay?
Yeah, great. Hi, Dave. Thank you.
You've been working from home, I guess, like everybody, and your kids are a bit older than John's 14 now. Is Zoom a big thing in your house?
It has been. It's been. I think it's an interesting shift here because, if I'd have thought that within a few weeks, my son's education would have flipped to using a model that for years we were arguing was possible, and many educators told us it wasn't, I wouldn't have believed them. I think that, is it a big thing? Yes. I'm not a big Friday night party person, but I certainly get a lot of invites to those sort of things. But is it huge? Absolutely. And hopefully it's here to stay as well. I think the thing is, previously what we're seeing with Zoom and what we're seeing with the recent changes is brilliant, because, previously it was, we were worried about my son, he'd go upstairs, he'd be on his Xbox for hours. We were missing the fact that he was talking to his friends whilst he's playing. He's collaborating. What we're now doing is we're bringing that collaboration to schooling. It's fantastic.
No, that's brilliant. And hold that thought, because that's the sort of the conversation I want to have at the end of this session, because I think that whole shift in the relationship with technology within education that's happened over the last few weeks is too important for us not to spend a lot of time talking about. So again, all of these links will be available to you. Again, talking about having kids at home, there is a fantastic organization. They're based in the UK, but they're global in reach, and they're called TechWillSaveUs. I once had the pleasure of sharing a stage with one of the founders, a lady called Bethany Kobe, who have put together this whole series of material and collateral that again is to help engage young minds with the potential of technology. And they do it from really early years learning through to secondary school. One of the things that they sent out is this fantastic guide to learning and playing at home, and a whole bunch of topics and activities for all ages for you to sit down and go through with your kids. They've tried to do this, and this came out at the early part of the lockdown. So there's a few things that I thought were really important. They called on some ideas about how to keep your kids motivated, but also to talk to them about what was going on in the world, about what was going on with COVID-19. There's an experiment where you can learn about how soap kills viruses. I'm just trying to get to that, which is the old sort of pepper and soap, pepper, water and soap experiment. But again, lots of great ideas. It's a bit late in the day now. I think many of you have actually figured out the relationship about having your kids home and how to deal with homeschooling. Not to say it's easy by any means, but there are some great ideas. And I would go back to TechWillSaveUs. I would keep looking at them. The other thing, I'll just give them a plug and just say that they're actually crowdfunding right now for the next round of funding. Again, if you're that way in mind, certainly worth a look at. I think they're a great organization, and I think the people behind it are doing good. So always good to look into. I'm going to just flip into that to something that I really do want to talk to Gary about, which is about how to work from home without losing your mind. Now, Gary, I know that you were for a long time working from home years ago, actually. So you built that resilience, and I know that actually you've been forced to do it in lockdown. This is an article from Wired that talks through some really important steps. Now, I'm hoping that most of you have figured this out, right? Most of you have figured out there's a difference between day pajamas and night pajamas, and that actually, live streaming Netflix while you're trying to work doesn't always end well. But there are some great sort of basics here about setting boundaries. I had a great conversation yesterday about, as much as I hate the commute, I actually really miss it, because that's the time where I decompress and I'm able to transition from work me to home me, and there's some ideas around there. So Gary, let me bring you in. How have you been coping with sort of the whole working from home thing? You must be a past master at this by now.
It's quite interesting, because I changed employees a few months ago, and one of the things that was really attractive about the new employer was the fact that, yes, they had a great work from home policy, but they also had a local office. Whereas previously, for my previous company, the main office was in London. My manager was in Germany. The development team was in the Netherlands. So it was really, truly distributed working. So actually, one of the attractive things about my new job was having a local office, because I'd missed it. But yeah, in terms of working from home, it takes a while to get used to it. I think what's interesting is, having done it for a while, and certainly done it for extended periods of months, it's interesting to see it introduced to a company. So the company I work for, Blue Prism, a robotics and automation company, it has a work from home policy, but like many companies, it's not had it sustained. It's been some days at home, some days at work, family first. But what a lot of people are finding is this is a really big change. The Wired article, for me, though, absolutely nails it. It is really simple steps that absolutely work. I think when I first started doing it, it was that we were treading new ground. Is it working from home? And I know, interestingly, one of the perceptions at the time was work from home, hey, couple of hours in the pajamas and then slope off, coffee every couple of hours. And it wasn't. What I found was, in many cases, I'm having to put the structure in, because if I'm not putting structure in, I'm doing more hours. I'm not having those interruptions. So, Sorry, go on, Dave.
Yeah, I was just what I is really funny, Gary, that you mentioned that, because the thing that I've started to realize now, because I've got sort of two types of friends. They're the friends that have been massively affected by this, who are out of work or furloughed or not doing much. And then I've got the other type, which is people like you, Gary, which is probably working harder now than you were when you were allowed out in public. And what I can see happening anecdotally is it's a bit of the old BlackBerry routine where people aren't able to segregate their work time from their home time. And so it's bleeding into sort of things. So you're actually just working all the time. So I think, that's something that we're going to really spend some time looking at. How do we help this whole sort of remote working thing become the norm? Gary, could I just push you for one top tip about working from home? What's the Gary Burt top tip for making the best of working from home?
I don't think there's one thing. If you're going to push me, have a dedicated space for work. It could be the corner of your room. Ideally, it's going to be a separate area. But go walk into your work zone and walk out of the work zone. Don't try not to blur the physical spaces if you can avoid it.
Love that. I am going to jump now to just a fantastic story. And then we're going to jump into a bit more on education. I was walking the dogs, which is not a euphemism. I was walking the dogs the other night with John. And as we were walking around, he was telling me this horror story about Disney suing some kid who'd changed their name to Nemo or whatever. And I'm like, dude, seriously, this is not something that Disney would do. Disney are a great brand. They love, the magic that they create. And then I saw this yesterday, which was just beautiful. And essentially, the hook of the story, and it's not as salacious actually as it appears, is that Disney have basically said if anybody using the May the 4th hashtag, by using the hashtag, agrees to abide by Disney's terms and conditions, which seems a bit heavy-handed, don't you think? As it turns out, if you read the small print, it's they've got some promotional tweets about Disney Plus, but they're still basically saying, we own that hashtag, you're not going to bloody use it. And I just think what a missed opportunity for a brand to support what is essentially a grassroots nerd initiative. Any thoughts on that, Gary?
It's such a corporate faceplant. I think there'll be a lot of people who are trying to build up the community reach inside Disney who will go, no, oh my God, the light. Brands thrive with engagement. If you start to close the engagement down, you're missing building your fan base. It's the opposite. Don't hoard the rights, give them away. Let people claim them. Let people own them. They'll take the benefit. They're launching the new service. You want people to talk about it. You don't want the news to be about you, your lawyers closing down discussion of May the 4th. You want May the 4th to be May the 4th. You own the rights to Star Wars. Let it grow. Put it out there.
I think we should teach our American cousins that we should go actually to be the 4th of May. It ruins the joke, but at least they won't get sued by Disney. So look, I'm just conscious of time, and so I want to jump into, what I think is probably one of the most important conversations. Every week I want to talk about the new normal. This week I want to talk a little bit about education. The kids went back last week after Easter. I thought the mood of both parents, teachers and kids was captured beautifully by this viral video. I don't know if you guys see it or not.
So as some of you guys might know, I'm a music teacher, and I found that one of the best ways that I can process the whole transition to online learning and teaching is to write a song. So I wrote a song. I'd like to share that with you guys now. Here we go.
Just brilliant. I got that from Billy Bragg, can you believe, who shared that. But it was also, I saw it on Have I Got News for You. That's kind of how people feel about this new world. I want to set the stage really for this. And it's this beautiful picture that you've heard me talk about before, taken back in 2014. Dutch photographer in the Rijksmuseum takes this picture of a bunch of kids, just innocently puts it on Facebook and Twitter saying it's a new generation of visitors to the Rijksmuseum, and then just gets slammed by all of the trolls talking about how terrible this is, about how sad it is that kids would be on technology. Somebody even tweeted just in emojis that they were so incensed. All of them failing to recognize that the kids had been asked by their teachers to use their smartphones to get more information about Rembrandt and this particular painting, The Night Watchman, and then talk to the group about how would they, about the painting and all that sort of stuff. So this was my starting point. Pre-COVID, this was a world where we adults were thinking how terrible technology is. And we had this awful stat. I mean, this really, really awful stat, which is 95% of schools in the UK ban the use of smartphones in lessons. And I get it. I get that they're distracting. But where would your bloody lessons be now, if we hadn't got the technology? And what we'd missed, and this is getting a bit ranty now, this is good. What we'd missed leading up to this moment is this is the time for us to help our kids to build a really positive, healthy relationship with technology. And I'm going to flip and bring Gary into this because I know you've got a passion about this. You and I used to work on this topic, but we've now had, 5 weeks to understand how education could be delivered, not just remotely, but delivered digitally. One of the things I've noticed, again, anecdotally, just from John's school is these guys have really upped their game coming back from Easter. Like, things are more organized, the lessons are really good, the teachers are engaging well. What do you think, Gary? Do you think we can sustain this? Do you think we can carry, and I'm not saying that the kids will never go back to school, but maybe there's an element of what we've learned that we could use, to go forward with. What do you think, Gary?
I think the first thing is it's fascinating. I mean, we were talking to schools and thinkers and people in government about this world 15 years ago, about this being possible. I think we were living in a very techno-privileged world. We had access to high-speed broadband at work. A lot of us had good connectivity at home, but that wasn't, I think we were probably a bit ambitious in terms of the time, but now broadband is there. A lot of people have laptops, a lot of kids have phones. So it's a perfect time. I think the one thing that comes up again and again and again with technology, particularly with kids, is stop trying to block it, embrace it. We saw the thing with schools talking about gaming. Instead of gaming, get the children, young adults to embrace technology, show the positives in technology. I think what's happened is our hand's been forced. For years, we've had an education model that has really been creaking at the seams. The idea that we can have children with the access to the world, literally the world's information at their fingertips outside the classroom. And then we go in, we point them at the board, we point them at a whiteboard and go, this is how you have to learn. We're using an education model that's 150 years old. And it's not just the technology's evolved. We've evolved. Humans have evolved to a far higher plane.
And you alluded to this earlier, Gary, actually. And one of the things that I sort of noticed is when the kids first went home and working from home, there was all this sort of concern about how the kids were going to cope. And I'm like, Jesus, most kids, actually, they go home and they're living their lives online. And look, I'll give you my experience, which is John. And so he engages with his mates every night, even though they live quite far apart, but he's hanging out with them. They're not just playing games. They're talking about homework and talking about things that kids talk about at school. So they're quite used to sticking on a headset and jumping on a call, video or not, with their mates and having a laugh. I worried about the bloody teachers. It was the poor teachers who, for the most part, don't get to engage with this. Now, there are a few out there that are already pushing this, and I just want to flip to bring in some lovely content from, there's a guy I know called Ian Phillips, who is the head of technology for Hab School in Watford, and he's put together this really, really fantastic set of materials for teachers, actually, because these are the people who I really think we owe them so much, but equally we need so much from them now to take this experience and to be able to sustain it in a world where the kids go back to school, because I think this is the opportunity for us to change. It's the opportunity for us to say, well, actually, these are the things that work well digitally, and these are the things that work well physically. How do we, rather than this binary, it's digital or it's physical, how do we build the best of that relationship together? What do you think the chances are, Gary?
This is a phenomenal opportunity for children to, really embrace the world of what work will be. It's really interesting when I look at what my son is learning in school and the way he's being taught. And his school is a leading technology centric school. It is a state school. They're doing well with technology, but underpinning this is an education model. So they're doing well in terms of the collaboration with the technology. But when they come to the subjects, they're still focused on around an exam system that's that involves them sitting down behind a piece of paper and writing down at the end of the 2 years of cramming, learning what they've learned. They couldn't be further away from the world of work and the skills that we need in a new company.
And it's funny because, I mean, one of the longer versions of this conversation is, I think there's a difference. You and I, Gary, we went to school in a world when knowledge was a scarce resource, right? You had to be in a specific location, typically a library or a place of study, to be able to access the world's knowledge. Well, now most people have access to everything, our society has ever known, and it's in a device that lives in their pocket. And what is now a scarce resource is wisdom. And the opportunity is to teach our kids how to acquire wisdom. So the example I use on stage is talking about the Battle of Hastings. And I asked the audience, who can tell me the year of the Battle of Hastings? And of course, everybody knows it was 1066. Then you say, okay, well, what was the date of the Battle of Hastings? And there's always a history nerd in the audience, and the history nerd will tell you it's the 14th of October. And then you ask them, what was the day of the week of the battle occurred? And pretty much nobody knows. And my question to you in the audience is, does that matter? And we're now in a place, Gary, talking about exams where, I think it's entirely likely that the kids will be off until the autumn term. So we're going to go through exams, and my heart goes out to anybody who was lined up for GCSEs or A-levels. But there were also a bunch of other students who are lined up for their regular sort of exams who are now going to do open book exams. And again, my hope from this experience is if you get the balance right, so we're going to ask you a load of questions. Yes, you could look up, but you won't have time, to look everything up. You need to know the building blocks of the knowledge of that particular subject, but you don't need to know everything. That to me is a really great bridgehead into the world that I think we could get into, where actually we move away from exams almost entirely, that sort of moment in time.
One of the things I'm absolutely certain this is going to do is we are going to rediscover the importance of creativity. There is no, as an organization, we have no problem asking for CVs and finding a load of very similar exam results. And it gives us absolutely no insight into the person. What we want is the person who can deal with a tricky, fuzzy, ill-defined problem. We want people who can create the future. So I think the biggest outcome of this is that we are going to realize, and we're going to be forced into the position of accepting the fact that when we look at exams, we're not going to be looking for the skill to replay. That Google have already, they've delivered that.
Yeah.
That we're not going to be looking simply at the skill to produce. We can write in Word. We can add up in Excel. We're going to be looking for the skills to combine, to assemble, to create, to think about what's not there, to make those connections. And I really hope that the move and the changes that we've seen over the last few weeks are really going to cause a groundswell of a change, an earthquake in education that's going to be impossible to move from. I hope that's the case, because if we don't, we're going to have a real problem with a lot of children who've seen what can be, and then they're being dragged into a world that they know doesn't have to exist.
So an earthquake in education with creativity as the catalyst. I love that, Gary. And that actually is the perfect place for us to end this week's conversation. I'm just conscious of time and I don't want to drag this out, even though we could talk, especially Gary and I, we could talk forever on this. I want to thank all of you for joining us. Great if you joined us live. It doesn't matter if you didn't join us live, you're listening on a podcast on Catch Up. That's great too. We're going to be doing this every week. Can I ask you, what do you think about A, the show? B, do you think the time works? At 6 o'clock on a Wednesday? It works for me because that was Star Trek time. But if you think there's a better time for you, let's see what we can work out. Thank you again for your time. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week with more stories about the rise of the humans and how you can get involved. Thank you, guys. Take care.
There are 1,000 stories in the Envisioners' future. This is just one of them.